right now, we think that it would take over a year or so for Iran to actually develop a nuclear weapon, but obviously we don't want to cut it too close. They are not yet at the point, I think, where they've made a fundamental decision to get right with the international community, but I do think that they're recognizing that there is a severe cost for them to continue on the path that they're on, and that there's another door open.
President Obama speaking to Israeli TV as he sets off for the Middle East this week. George Will is back, along with Madeleine Albright, former Secretary of State for President Clinton, Stephen Hadley, former National Security Advisor for President George W. Bush, and General James Cartwright, former Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Welcome to all of you. This is indeed a powerhouse roundtable, I would say. Secretary Albright, let's start with what this trip is really about. It doesn't appear to have anything to do with any peace process. It seems to be about Iran. Why is he going?
Well, I think it's very important. The president, in his first trip of the second term, to go to Israel, to meet with Prime Minister Netanyahu and his new government, and to discuss generally issues, I think, in the Middle East. There are an awful lot of things to talk about: Iran, Syria, and the region generally, and I'm sure that the peace talks, or the lack of them, is something that is going to be part of the discussion. But it's important. The president also wants to talk to the Israeli people. He is going to give a speech to the public, not to the Knesset.
And he's not very popular with the Israeli people, according to the latest polls.
I think he's more popular than people think. I think that they understand the American position, and basically that the United States is there in an indissoluble relationship with the Israelis. And that's very clear from the president's actions and from American foreign policy issues.
Mr. Hadley, do you agree with that? Is he going over there really to talk about Iran?
I think Madeleine has a right. He will talk about Iran, but I think actually the most important part of it is what he says to the Israeli people. There are some messages that they want to hear, that we're unequivocally committed to Israel's security, that security has a right, that Israel has a right to defend itself against terror, that he supports Israel as a homeland for the Jewish people whose roots to the land go back millennia. There are things that they need to hear from him to reestablish the tie between an American president and the Israeli people. We can then talk about peace process, Iran and Syria, but I think the most important thing is really what he says to the Israeli people.
But let's go to Iran, General Cartwright. All I remember from last fall is that picture of Benjamin Netanyahu in front of the UN with that ticking time bomb. And he basically drew the line this spring, this summer, for any sort of action against the nuclear facilities in Iran. Do you still think that? You heard what President Obama said. Do you think the Israelis have changed their mind about that timeline?
My sense is that there's some ambiguity. Nobody knows exactly what the timeline is. And so one of the good things about this trip is that it's coming without some sort of promise of a big announcement. In other words, we're going to listen, we're going to go compare our facts, we're going to get some sense of where we're going, both on the Iran issue, but also on Middle East peace at large, as to where both sides are, what they're doing, a chance for the president to reach out and say, this is what we're thinking, without saying this is our agenda and this is the way it's going to end up. And I think that's very important. I think that carries a very powerful message, because clearly nobody knows exactly what's happening in Iran, and clearly nobody knows exactly how Middle East peace should evolve. And there are questions about these issues, and it's a good time to listen as well as talk.
I agree that the president's there to establish a kind of trust with the Israeli people, but not so that he can move forward with an Israeli-Palestinian settlement. The Israelis have been living with terrorism at high or low levels for 60-some years. That's not the problem now. He wants their trust, so they will give him time on Iran. But listen to what the president just said. The president said...
So he's stretching out the diplomacy clearly.
Yes, but he said they may be as much as a year away, but let's not cut it close. A year is close, given the, to say no more, fallible nature of the U.S. intelligence estimates.
And if Netanyahu has already made that threat, in a way, by holding up that timeline, he has to kind of stick to that, doesn't he?
Well, I think that, from what I understand, the Israelis now understand that the Iranians have slowed down some of their enrichment possibilities and diverted some of them to peaceful uses for medical purposes. That was told to me by Israelis at various times. And so I think they are trying to develop that ambiguity that the general was talking about, because I think nobody is ready to just abandon diplomacy. And what you've seen with the P5+1, and it's a slow discussion, but in fact there are negotiations going on, and there's some talk about bilateral ones.
General Cartwright, you think they can move that?
My sense is that there is some ambiguity out there and that nobody's sure. And you don't want to have a situation in which you're not ready, but you also don't want to rush the answer. And so this is an opportunity to compare notes.
It's an opportunity. One other thing, again, on the theme that he has, his primary audience really is the Israeli people. I think what he has to say is, if diplomacy fails and it comes time to do something about Iran, I, as President of the United States, will do it. We are not going to put this on Israel. And we know that the Israelis, in terms of public opinion, they do not want to do something unilaterally. They want to do anything with the United States. And I think the President has to say clearly, if something needs to be done about Iran, we, the United States, will do it.
I want to move on to another threat, of the North Korea threat, if we can. And the announcement this week that we are adding 14 interceptors, missile interceptors, because the North Korean threat is so high and they've moved faster. Let's listen to Secretary Hagel.
The reason we're advancing our program here for Homeland Security is to not take any chances, is to stay ahead of the threat.
We believe that this young lad ought to be deterred by that, and if he's not, we'll be ready.
General Cartwright, that was a pretty alarming statement, I thought, and to have Hagel come out and to have Admiral Winfield say that they have moved faster than we thought. Is this alarming? Should we be scared?
Well, it's alarming in the rhetoric side of the equation here. And it is clearly asked the administration, or propelled the administration, towards a shift in the missile defense program. It's a program that has always been labeled as one that tries to pace the threat. In other words, don't build something until you need it. Clearly, the shift that's going on inside the administration is to reduce the reliance or the focus on the regional capabilities that were put out. These are the Patriots and the SM-3s off the ships. And to start to focus again back onto the strategic, on the homeland. And these are the ground-based interceptors in California and Alaska.
And it's those mobile missiles, those mobile intercontinental ballistic missiles.
The threat is the mobile missiles, potentially, which has not really emerged yet, but it is time to make sure that we're ready for it. And the infrastructure's been put in place in Alaska for these missiles. That's not a problem. The issue is, how fast do we want to build missiles to put into those silos to be ready? And are they ready? Is there more testing that could be done? And so we're basically seeing a shift of money off of the regional side into the strategic side. I think that's one key point here. The second key point is that, from at least from my perspective, what is being spewed in the way of rhetoric out of North Korea is a focus on, we're going to attack the homeland, our homeland, we're also going to attack the South Koreans. If that's true, if we're worried about that, there's another part of this. You never really want to worry just about a strategic attack. You have to focus on your special operations forces and your border capabilities in the United States to make sure that this is not an asymmetric approach to the problem.
Secretary Albright was in North Korea in 2000. What happened after that? Why are we in the place we are today?
Well, the Clinton administration had active diplomacy with North Korea. They were making some progress. We had a conversation offline about the transition between the two administrations, which was probably less than perfect. The Bush administration pursued diplomacy in September 2005, got a commitment from North Korea that it would get out of the nuclear business. But of course, in parallel with all of that, North Korea was pursuing an enrichment program, another route to a nuclear weapon that was done covertly and in violation of the understandings we all had with them.
Well, I believe so. I mean, I had some really remarkable discussions with Kim Jong-il. We had a missile moratorium. We also were in the middle of discussions with them. They said that they would, we could leave our troops in South Korea. We came back. You know, Americans were confused about the election of 2000, and I'm sure that Kim Jong-il was also. And I do think it is unfortunate that the cards that we left on the table were not picked up. But the story on North Korea is a complicated one of threats and discussions and diplomacy. You are dealing with a very erratic leadership in North Korea. And what concerns me now is that the kind of language that is coming out of North Korea, I think, is well balanced by what the president has decided on the mobile missiles.
I'm puzzled by the language coming out of Washington. I would like to see struck from the language of our diplomacy the words acceptable and unacceptable. Last week at the Asia Society in New York, Thomas Donilon, the National Security Advisor to President Obama, said the following: the United States will not accept North Korea as a nuclear state. Unless I'm missing something, it's been a nuclear state for more than half a decade.
That was a puzzling statement.
What does it mean? Obviously, we have a problem dealing with a regime that may be a little bit crazy because deterrence depends on rational calculation on the other side. Stalin, for all his defects, was a rational calculator. We don't know if Iran is. We certainly don't know if this odd fellow who runs North Korea is rational and therefore subject to deterrence.
We had another kind of threat this week that we talked about, the worldwide threat assessment. You had the Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, talking about what he thought was the biggest threat to our homeland now.
When it comes to distinct threat areas, our statement this year leads with cyber, and it's hard to overemphasize its significance.
The seriousness and the diversity of the threats that this country faces in the cyber domain are increasing on a daily basis.
General Cartwright, you spend a lot of time looking at cybersecurity, cyber attacks. Obviously, there's a difference here. It's not just spying, it's taking down a grid. How serious the threat? What do we do about it?
Well, the threat is emerging, and it's emerging quickly. And it's not just from one actor. It's not just the Chinese. I mean, it is a threat that covers both industry.
President Obama pretty much pointed the finger at the Chinese.
Well, he did, and I think that was appropriate. But what we've got to do, and what we have said multiple times, at least what I have said, is we have to start talking about not just a pure defense. We have to start to build an offensive capability. What I thought was important about this week's news was the fact that we started to have that conversation about offensive capabilities, about there being a price for these kind of attacks.
And that means you go after someone else's network, you go after the Chinese. That's complicated in so many ways. Would we protect our allies if they're attacked?
It is very complicated. But I think General Cartwright is absolutely right. The announcement that was interesting this week was that Keith Alexander announced that there were going to be some 17 offensive cyber teams. If you only play defense, you're going to lose. It's just too hard to be able to parry every strike. What you need to do is change the calculus so that those people doing these attacks understand that they will pay a greater penalty than the benefits they get. There are complicated legal issues, policy issues, but unless we get into that space, these attacks will not stop.
I want to go to something you're all very familiar with. We have a new poll. It's the 10-year anniversary of the invasion of Iraq. You were certainly involved in that. A Washington Post poll shows on this 10-year anniversary, 58%, or 6 in 10 Americans, say the war in Iraq was not worth fighting. The poll also shows that the support for the war in Afghanistan is similar, with 56% of Americans saying the war was not worth it. We have a very short time here, but I want to start with you, Mr. Hadley, because you had a hand in both of these wars. Would you do it differently?
They clearly took longer, cost more in terms of life and treasure of Americans, coalitions, and the people in those countries. But we have accomplished something in Iraq. We have a government that is not a threat to our national security, that is an ally in the war on terror, and unusual in the Middle East, where Sunni, Shia, and Kurds are trying to work together for a democratic future. It's a big investment, an important investment, and we are risking that investment by sitting on our hands while Syria melts down and where Syria's violence will destabilize Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, and Turkey.
You asked Mr. Hadley if we would do it differently. The question to me is, would we do it at all? If in 2003 we'd known what we know now, the absence of weapons of mass destruction, the difficulty of governing and occupying a society in which once you lop off the regime, you're going to have a civil war and a sectarian tribal society, the answer is, I think, obviously, no, we would not do it again.
Mr. Hadley?
But can I say...
You make these decisions based on what you know at the time. We made that decision based on what we know at the time, and I think that's George right. I think
if you knew what you knew now, would you have done it?
I think the American people wouldn't have supported it. But my point is we did it, we got something of value, and we should be protecting it and not squandering that enormous investment we made.
I can understand why these two poll numbers go together. I supported President Bush on Afghanistan because that is where the people that attacked us on 9/11 came from. The Bush administration took their eye off the ball in Afghanistan in order to go to Iraq for God knows what reason. And we now are in a position where neither war is being supported, and we are worried about what is going to happen next. I fully agree with Steve that we now have to worry about what infrastructure there is in Iraq, also in Afghanistan, and the spillover that this has on Syria.
Thank you all for joining us. This was indeed a powerhouse roundtable. Thank you. And Secretary Albright will stick around to answer your question for today's Web Extra.